was, and thank you. I feel a bit daunted following those two amazing speakers, but hey ho, I'm going to practice a little bit about what Pete suggested, which is not letting the anxiety in. So it's what you all wanted now. It's death by PowerPoint, because I tend to do a lot of things in PowerPoint. So yeah, so I'm really here to talk about how to support colleagues. And really, these are just lessons from the Christian Therapist Chair. We work as counsellors who are Christians in all different settings. So we can't always overtly bring our faith into what we're doing. And so this is really kind of lessons from the therapy chair. So just very briefly, a little introduction to the Association of Christian Counsellors. So we are a membership body for professionally qualified counsellors and psychotherapists who identify as Christians. And that's mainly just so that we can be a fellowship body together. We can provide a directory of counsellors for people who want to choose a counsellor who has faith, which may well be Christians, but also people of other faiths often choose to come to a counsellor of faith because they know that faith will be taken seriously and honoured in the process of their counselling. But we work in all contexts with people of all faiths and none. And we're the only Christian body that's got an accredited register under the Professional Standards Authority. So if you like, we're like the BACP, only people who self-identify as Christians and with that level of membership. And we have an online directory of counsellors. So if you do come across people who are looking explicitly for professionally qualified, safe, indemnified counsellors who are working under Code of Ethics, then you can come to our website and find somebody to support them. So that's just the introduction to the Association of Christian Counsellors. So this is a kind of lesson in how not to support someone. And this comes from my own kind of life experience. So back when I first graduated from university, I was working in a store that doesn't exist anymore, a chain called British Home Stores. And because I wasn't really a Saturday girl anymore, and I was just not quite sure what I wanted to do, so I was just like one of the other called girls of the shop floor. I remember one morning arriving for work, and one of the women who worked at British Home Stores, and a woman who was older than me, she had been off for her daughter's marriage, but her daughter had actually died on her wedding day. She'd had a heart attack and died as a very young woman. And at the time, and I'm sure it's the same with retail departments now, there was a practice of having young people, either from degrees or A-levels, and putting them on a management training scheme and moving them around the country. So that section that I worked on had this very young manager who arrived for the morning briefing, all kind of chirpy. And this woman was her first day back at work, the woman who had been bereaved. And I can't remember her name, but say her name was Jean. And this manager said, "Hello, Jean. Nice to have you back. Did you have a nice holiday?" And the woman looked at her and said, "My daughter died." And then just ran down the shop floor. And this young woman was like a rabbit, with headlights, thinking, what have I done wrong? And she said to everybody, well, I know her daughter died, but I thought they went on holiday afterwards. So that's how not to support people at work. It's an extreme example, but it's also very true. This idea of kind of othering people as if, I don't know what kind of dynamics were working in that poor young woman's head, but she got it spectacularly wrong. So how to support someone, again, from my kind of own life. I won't go into too much details, but, when I was, I had two young children, I was in a relationship with somebody, and that relationship was a very extreme form of what's now called coercive control. But I also needed desperately to work, and it came to a point anyway where I just literally had to pack up what I could in some bags and flee. And I hadn't told anybody at work, and I was, for a kind of relatively young adult, I was in a relatively senior position. It wasn't a grand job, but it was in the private sector and it was in a financial institution, so it was all very formal. And I felt so much shame. I hadn't told anybody about my private circumstances. And I just rang up my boss and I, for the first time, told him about how I'd been living and what I'd had to do. And he was amazing. And he just said, just don't worry about it. Whatever you need to do, you do. Your job's here for you. Even though I'd had to actually move to another part, could still commute, but quite a considerable distance away. And then I did return to work, and work was literally my salvation because it kept me sane. But everybody around me, without talking, without being intrusive, without saying, oh, what happened? Tell me all about it, because it was all very raw and still very shameful. They would just, in very gentle, very kind ways, show their support and care for me. And that is a very good way of how to support someone at work. And I also had, because this person was very abusive, they would ring up, they would try and get through to, the switchboard and my colleagues. And I would notice when a colleague would have picked up a call, because I could tell by their face the kind of what was happening, and they just slowly put the phone down and not say anything to me and just kind of nod and just get on with their work. So that is a very good way to support people at work. So just bearing those in mind, two quite extreme examples, but both ones that happened to me. So I wanted to start with us really reflecting out of our experience, just spending a few moments thinking about what were the quality of those who've supported us at work, and what did they do, and what was most helpful. I'll just give a few moments for people to kind of think about that. I forgot to set my timer, so I'm just setting that now. And we can maybe come back to this in the question and answer thing, or you might want to pop some things in chat. But often it's through our own experience that we can actually kind of model out again to others the kind of gifts that were given to us. So something about kind of work and what work means, and maybe how we've kind of grown up with ideas about work and this perception of work and life. And you often find people talk about the work-life balance as if they're kind of separate spaces. So if I look at my kind of public space, my work life, I've had periods, most of my early childhood and into early adulthood, I studied, then I worked. And then I trained to be a counsellor. So I had a big, long period of studying again. And now I'm working again. So that's kind of like my work kind of pattern, if you like. And then in private spaces, I've had a series of relationships. I've been a parent. I've had some adverse events, one I've just spoken about. I've had some really celebratory events, and I've had leisure time. So we can often think of these as very kind of different and distinct and discrete spaces, but actually they're very entwined. Work involves relationships. It involves some pleasure, some life satisfaction. Can be a life event when we leave a job, when we start a new job, involve losses and gains. And private life involves some kind of activities that are work-like. There's often a lot of work to be done at home. It involves responsibility, involves pressures, deadlines, and some kind of challenges around decision-making. So they're not really as distinct spheres as we think that they might be. Right, where am I? So there's a big overlap, and there's a tendency sometimes to underestimate the importance of work in terms of someone's overall personal well-being. And there can be a perception of having less choice in the public sphere of work and more choice in the private sphere of home. And that's not true for all, but often people can feel trapped in work because of kind of financial constraints, because of ideas that they can't move on, that there are no other jobs. So people can feel very kind of stuck. And similarly, people can feel very stuck in domestic spaces where, again, they might be subject to kind of difficult relationships that they feel that they can't lay down or let go of. So either can be a den of lions or a sanctuary or somewhere in between. And Freud said love and work are the cornerstones of what it is to be human and are the goals of a healthy life. And of course, that echoes really something of what we understand as Christians about our own anthropology. So we're designed to work and to rest, and to do both in loving relationships with one another as helpmates for one another. So I think that's just to emphasize the importance of work for people and how much we can do in the workspace to really improve the quality of how we relate to one another, which in turn improves the quality of our lives together. Right. So supporting others in the workplace, we really need to draw from our rich tradition of the care of souls and pastoral care. So in a Christian understanding, it's a foundational mission of to love one another as I have loved you. But our challenge is that our work context is not a church context. It's not an outreach ministry. It is not somewhere where we may be able to talk overtly about our faith. We may be able to, but it may not just be appropriate. And religions, as Andrew has so well, I think, explained this morning, generally give rise to recognition of meaning and value arising from suffering. So suffering, including mental health, including our physical health, including the challenges that sometimes we can face well and other times defeat us, they're not really a personal failing, but the reality of living in a broken world. And they can galvanize us to overthrow oppression, to take action, to be energized. So we have that thing about things happen to us, and then we can work through them and overcome them. But the challenges in the workplace is complicated by issues relating to power and authority, to fairness and justice, to transactional aspects of working contracts and agreements, to limits of confidentiality, and to the context in which we work and the culture in which we work. So what I mean by that is, if they actually, depending on, if somebody is just not performing their job, there's an issue of fairness, and because of what they're going through, because of their mental health problems, there is an issue of fairness and justice to all the people who are performing their job. If you are in a position of authority with someone and they find maybe you're questioning, however well intended, about their private life, wanting to know whether they're okay, from them, in their perception, they might be that you may be making them feel even more vulnerable in a situation of vulnerability, because they're worried about what that means if I open to my boss about what's going on. Will I lose my job? Will I fear loss of promotion? So, there are contracts of work. There are particularly cultures of work that demand certain things. We have to take account of fairness and justice across the piece. We also have to look at the reality of power relationships at work, so we don't compound somebody's distress. So above all, the support that we provide needs to be appropriate, it needs to be sensitive, and it needs to be boundaried so that we protect the people that we're trying to help. Okay. Sometimes it's helpful to distinguish between what I would call sort of primary stresses, kind of current things that are kind of, you can easily, meaningfully see why somebody is in a bit of a state at work. Maybe because they're experiencing domestic abuse, maybe because they've suffered bereavement or another loss. They might have had to move home. They might have had to have a loss of a significant relationship or friendship. They might have experience of a traumatic event, a car crash, something that's happened from an external event happening in their life. They have a relationship breakdown, a major illness, or suddenly have a caring responsibility. So when there's a known cause, it's often easier to help people because you can kind of move into problem solving or problem alleviating activities. And again, it's really important to offer non-intrusive support. So we don't need people to tell us all about what's happening to them, to notice that, or to be aware that something has, and to be able to signpost them to sources of help and support, to offer practical and emotional help. And overall, there's a sense often with events like this, there's a sense of it being time limited with an ending or a goal in mind. So in a way that's easier psychologically to support someone. You say, oh, here's a crisis. We can help someone through it. And it's also easier to communicate that to others in terms of fairness and justice. when to say, well, actually someone's going through a really hard time, so we need to cut them some slack at the moment. And we would do the same for you if that happened to you. So often that's easier. And then there's the persistent, secondary. It doesn't mean that they're less important, but just things, I mean secondary is that they arise out of life events. So I think Andrew and Peter have spoken about this, just this sense of, the way that our life is formed and the adverse events that we might have can leave us with these kind of imprints, chronic stress and anxiety, low self-esteem, sense of lack of agency and helplessness, sometimes problematic feelings that leads to problematic behaviours. So people can be very angry, assertive, aggressive. They can have dependencies and addictive type behaviours. And often people form rigid belief sets or patterns of relating, that kind of sense in which everybody always projects the worst onto someone. But they've asked me to do that work. They're definitely getting at me. They're picking on me. So it's very rigid ways of kind of looking at what's happening in terms of power dynamics. And so maybe we'll never know, and they don't even know. They're not even aware of the cause of this problem. Oh, sorry, I've gone too fast. I'm just trying to move you guys so I can see what I've written. And there's no obvious problem to resolve. There isn't something that you can say to somebody, oh, I know you've been going through a hard time. So, and these types of experiences or things that we observe in others, they're hard, they're complex, they can be even daunting. It's easier to kind of look away sometimes. Sometimes it's hard to know where to begin to have a conversation without intruding, particularly if people have rigid beliefs about what happens at work and what must be the meaning behind your question. And basically, you're in for the long game. You are in for the long game as well with people who've got kind of, known problems, because often they have impacts, but that it's going to be much harder work here to do. So it's definitely easier in some ways to support those where there's an obvious primary stressor, and harder with this more persistent chronic experience of mental health conditions where there may be no obvious cause. But in either case, the intention must be to offer sensitive, appropriate support that is sustainable over time. And I'd like to kind of emphasize here that it's not really an us and them problem. So it's likely that we will have experienced mental health challenges, adverse life events. Very few of us would have not been impacted at the moment by events on the world stage, by the pandemic, by the war in Ukraine, by the cost of living crisis, as well as our ordinary life stresses and events. And some level of anxiety or despair is perfectly normal. We spoke about that. It's a normative part of living life on earth, and it's an appropriate response in these times. But again, I think it was Andrew who said that we can heal from our scars rather than our wounds, and to have this as a kind of resource within us of like, I get this, I understand, and it's happened to me as well. So I think that's really helpful to think of ourselves as part of the same world and the same beingness, and not othering the people at work who are more obviously maybe suffering from mental health problems that are more obvious to people. So just some stats in Survey of Mental Health and Wellbeing in England, 2014 is the latest time that this was taken. So that's quite a considerable time ago, and a lot has happened since then. 1 in 6 people in households experience mental health problems. And I think it's about 1 in 5 people have thought about suicide at some point in their lives. And the Office for National Statistics, just looking at the pandemic, saw exponential rise in anxiety, in the prevalence of depression, actually. But I'm sure that if they had done a study on anxiety, and often they're linked conditions anyway, would have seen that actually there's a real peak of depression during this time. So here's some lessons from the therapist chair. So research consistently shows that all approaches to therapy are effective. So it doesn't matter. I mean, as long as they're by trained, qualified people, I want to say. So it doesn't matter so much what you do. And the quality of the therapeutic relationship is a key factor in the success of the relationship. So it's really about how you do it. So it's about the qualities that you can bring as a person, as well as your skills around listening well, that really make the difference. So the person of the therapist and how they relate is an agent of change in therapy. And I'm not saying we're doing therapy when we're helping people at work. Please be clear about that. But we can, a therapist would always in their training begin with themselves. And we learn to relate well to ourselves, to others, and God as a kind of key component of the training in this work. And I think that that is something that we can all benefit from. So if we begin on ourselves, we can reflect on our life and our accompanying mental health experiences and challenges. It's really important, this, me too, idea about that we become self-aware and become aware of our own feelings in different contexts, but without judging those, exercising self-compassion and uncovering some of our core beliefs. And I think Andrew was talking about this. So questions like, why do I always feel anxious when I meet X or Y or Z? What about that situation makes me feel anxious? Why, when I go out with a dear friend, do I always come back and just feel completely deflated? Why, when I am asked to do this type of work, I feel quite excited and motivated? And why do I feel always that I'm inadequate when I'm asked to do something else? So those kind of self-reflect. It's a really important thing is not to judge, is not to say, oh, why can't I just feel happy when I'm in company with so-and-so because they're a lovely person? Why do I feel this way? It's just to be really aware and have that compassion. And then uncovering some of our core beliefs, if this happens then. And I think as Christians, we can have very edifying beliefs, but often in childhood, and certainly in my childhood, I can have some quite difficult core beliefs about God as a very harsh judge, about always falling short of the mark, for example. So there's a lot of anxiety that was kind of sown in childhood around faith, which is generally intended to be a source of strength and growth. But particularly in adverse circumstances, those early core beliefs can come back. Oh, I failed again. I've been found wanting again. So just become aware of ourselves, because when we become aware of ourselves, we're much more empathetic to the fact that other people, the things that we kind of lay on them and think, well, put meaning on them and say, well, they must be behaving like that because, could be completely different. We've kind of created this fantasy in our life about what's going on for them and how they're interpreting things, which could be completely different. And then I think it's really important, and I think Pete talked about this, about his worshipping in the spirit, reading the word, but it's also the ancient spiritual, the disciplines that allow us to become calm and centered and curious. So again, it's letting aside as far as we can our anxiety about things, but really curious about the otherness of others in a very gentle and giving way. And developing our empathy muscles. There, but for the grace of God, go I. And my kind of pet theory is that because we're born and designed to be empathetic, we find the suffering of others difficult, because it's painful to witness. And often that moves people very into a direction of wanting to help, to alleviate the suffering. And then if people don't accept the help, they can then feel, oh, well, I told them what to do. They didn't do that, so therefore, in a way, I can kind of shut myself off. It's a kind of defensive thing. I don't really need to, because it's really their fault because they weren't taking my advice. They should have done this. But that sort of thing there, but for the grace, go, I can't, there's a famous thing, you can't understand unless you walk a mile in somebody else's footsteps. So just holding that kind of idea that we can't really know the world of the other. And then also practicing, particularly when we're working in contexts which are not Christian, bracketing away our core beliefs and judgments so that we can better serve another. So we're not already clouded with these beliefs about what's right for the other. Just check my time here. Okay, and some models which are quite helpful to just, guide us in this. There's the kenosis model that Christ, even though he was God, he emptied himself and took on the mantle of a servant to help another. And that's really helpful in Christian counselling circles, because you have all sorts of judgments and worries about people. Actually, if you can kind of bracket yourself and be radically available to the other, It's a very helpful kind of model. Another one is the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan had no agenda, didn't particularly want to take the traveller to Samaria and convert the person to the benefits of living in Samaria and thing. He actually gave the injured traveller what the person needed, which was a place to shelter, money for medicines. And then he came back to check that all was okay and left some more money. So again, focus on what does that person need at the moment, not what I want for them, but what do they most need? And then Buber's idea, kind of Jewish theologian, of the I-thou relationship. So we're not objectifying people. We're not saying you're kind of the I, it, them over there, they are. It's this idea of mutuality and reciprocity, that we are both worthy of dignity and respect, and we can engage at that level rather than being separate and detached from one another. I think we also need to be just really sensitive about the risks of openness for the person who is suffering at work. So in my case, it was this desire to protect my sanctuary of work. And I didn't really, I didn't really want anybody to know what was going on for me, because work was such a sanctuary. And I think there can be a fear of people opening up about things, particularly if they're shameful. If work is the kind of toxic environment which is causing distress to people, sometimes people can feel really unsafe to speak out. So they feel they are in the lion's den. Already kind of mentioned how opening up about ourselves can make ourselves feel vulnerable. So trust in the workplace is absolutely vital, that you can offer a trusted ear. I think we all have this fear of being judged, labelled, and there's still stigma associated with mental health problems. I think it's lessening, but there still is stigma. And how that can impact on, there's a fear how it can impact on your working relationships. You might have a good relationship with somebody at work. You want to protect that and not let them know that actually you're really struggling with something, either in your personal life or with one of these chronic stressors. It's a big thing about fear of consequences for promotion, prospects and career, and that's particularly in some sort of, more professional environments. I can remember my husband saying, managing director was him. He was a finance director in a big company, and managing director was in Lyft, and my husband was suffering from really bad IBS at the time, and the managing director, and he just went, because his stomach could, and the managing director turned to him and said, "Are you okay?" And my husband Martin just said, yeah, no, it's fine. I'm absolutely fine. He said, "You don't have IBS, do you? Or anything stress related to you?" Martin was saying, no, it's fine, it's fine. Important thing. I need to be tough to work here. I need to be able to manage all this stuff. No curiosity, no, "Oh, are you okay?" It was not that tone at all. And there's the additional stress sometimes of unhelpful impositions. And this thing that I said before, this unhelpful advice giving, which is people trying to fix things and then blame the person for not being fixed because it's hard to tolerate the pain of others. So first steps, I think, when you notice somebody that you think something is really going on for them, or you notice behaviour changes, or you just see that they're unhappy, so tread gently and slowly with permission from them. And there's no absolute need to know what's going on in order to help people feel supported and held. So I notice that you haven't been yourself lately. Is there anything going on? I don't need to know the details, but is there anywhere I can help you? Be really sensitive to power relationships and boundary issues, and always communicate in a way that's appropriate, that's fair, that's consistent and trustworthy. And again, if you're in a position of authority over someone and you think that's going to exacerbate their suffering, you may need to delegate the helping. So by going to the HR department, or by rallying some kind of people in the same team and at the same level of the person who's suffering. And there's what I think John Swinton always talks about, the importance of spiritual friendship and accompaniment. So always recognizing the intrinsic worth and dignity of the other. And that comes over as we talk to people. You're engaging in healthy relationships of accompaniment rather than wanting to give advice or solve problems. And what you're offering, and what we do offer, is holding on to the hope of change and a resolution of better times ahead. It's often when people are experiencing these very difficult kind of either mental health, persistent mental health problems or life events, it's very hard to know that there's a way out of them. And we can hold the hope. And in our language, we can hold the hope of things better. Like, when you're through this, can you imagine the day when you feel better? I know that people often can get better from this condition. Yeah, what would most help you? What could we most do for you to help you do that? So just checking my time. I come up with a kind of very little kind of model around a word, keyword for us, grace. So to help it, even if you think, I don't know what to do, right, grace. So it's greet, be warm, attentive and kind to work people, to people who phone you up, to cross suppliers, to everyone. Be warm, attentive and kind. So people know that you are a person who can be approached. The R, respect for the person and their preferences and the pace at which they want to move and to reveal things to you. The A, attend to their needs in emotional and practical ways and be an advocate for them when they can't act for themselves. The C, provide comfort and care, active listening and demonstrations of empathy. And most importantly, be an example, be open about our experiences, act from a calm place, model an authentic way of being, be consistent and trustworthy. I think we're just nearly at the end. And this most important thing, maybe the most kind of, like imperceptible thing that we can transmit to people is holding hope, encouraging empathy, encouraging their agency. And often, we live in a kind of world where we feel what's lurking around the corner and what's in the shadows. To really begin to move, help people to move into the mindset that what's hiding in the shadows and waiting around the corner might be sources of joy, of light, of resolutions. And that can encourage agency and change and people having a more positive mindset. And I think that's the end. Oh yeah. So just as a reminder, I'll just go back. So it's all about invitations. You're inviting people. I noticed that. What would be most helpful for me to do now? How can I best help you? And would you like to join us or me? So that idea of connection and of connecting with people, even if it's not talking about their problems, but, do you want to come and have a cup of tea? Would you like to join me as we're looking through this? Can I walk to your car with you? So that being with. So I think that's the end. So thank you for your time and attention. I hope it's not too death by PowerPointy.